Look at you, healthy girl. I got some M&Ms too. Well, we have a scheduled 1 o'clock meeting. did, and
Have you heard about the Messenger Kids app? It's a messaging and video chat app that's made for kids and controlled by parents. Designed for kids with endless filters, stickers, and games, and parents can set up and access control features directly from their own Facebook account. It's the perfect app to use for your child's next virtual play date with friends and family. Free to download and easy and fun to use. Messenger Kids, made for kids, controlled by parents.
it's a great day, Helen Williams. This is Julia. With who? I'm sorry. Let me see. I don't know if we have anyone by that name here. Okay, have a good one.
tripwire over there for? Oh, your computer.
Yeah.
If you didn't understand, I was
Joking.
joking about that Zoom call. She goes, "What are you funny?"
Oh, that's not funny that she said that. It's a good day, Colleen. This is Julia. Hi, can you hear me? want to send you to someone who will look it up for you.
Hello there.
Hello.
Hello.
It's just you and me.
Well, couldn't be any better than that. How are you doing, ma'am?
Good. So I'm guessing the ID I just sent you worked, or did he even ask you for one?
Well, and the other, when I punched in what Eddie had put in this morning, it said invalid. So then I did, once you gave me I did join meeting and it asked for the ID and the password. And I used the ones you gave me.
Oh, and it worked. Okay, good.
So it worked okay. So it's going to be interesting to see, where these contracts 101, we have different levels of people coming to these. So we'll see, who shows up, if anybody shows up, doing it this different way. But I'm happy for anybody to be here and learn about all this good stuff. So how's it going there at the office?
It's good. It's slow.
Yeah.
So
So is the office itself open so someone can come in?
yep.
Like you like to get an option fee receipt or something like that?
Yep. So anyone can walk up in here.
Okay.
Give me the disease.
Mm.
No, but it's been pretty slow. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you up at the front?
yeah.
Okay. Well, good.
So
And we'll get to see if somebody wants to come in and join the Zoom.
yeah.
Work through that. Kind of do it. Is Mike there?
Yes, he is.
It's really amazing. He's been here more than ever during this thing. I mean,
Oh
he's
yeah, every day. Yeah.
yeah, here all the time.
Every day, all day. He's here.
And I'm there in spirit.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so work through that
Yeah.
and deal with it.
Which is good.
Yep.
So.
So
my
we'll
mom was
see.
saying-
So who?
Go ahead.
No, what were you saying?
I was saying that Mom was telling me that the Rockwell office had a Zoom masquerade party where they
Oh,
all
really?
wear their mask on Zoom.
That's great.
Yeah. So
I love that.
I thought that was creative.
And we're going to do a game thing in Plano Thursday night.
Yeah. A game.
Is
night.
that this coming Thursday?
Yes.
Okay, and I was kind of seeing what Lori was saying on that. I'm not sure I totally understand it, but I think it'll be interesting. Anything we can do to keep people involved and keep the spirits up will be a good thing.
And there was talk about a happy hour on here.
Yeah.
You know, everyone just sitting around on Zoom and drinking.
Well, Tommy and Pete would be really good at that. Yeah.
They wouldn't even know the difference. They wouldn't even know that you weren't supposed to drink on Zoom. So.
Yeah, drinking while on Zoom could be an interesting combination.
We'll see how it goes. Oh.
Well, if only a couple of people show up, it'll be an easier thing to mute and unmute, so that won't be a problem.
Yeah. So you were saying that on the documents you sent out, or that Julie sent out yesterday,
Yeah.
there's questions that you're
Yeah.
going to be asking them?
Yes,
Okay.
because we've got 7 paragraphs that we're looking at, and in each of the paragraphs, I asked the question, what's the purpose of the paragraph?
Oh,
So I want them to be able to give me a little bit of an idea of what they think the purpose of the paragraph is. Okay,
Oh.
who just showed? Oh, hello, James. Hi, James.
Hello, Bob.
How are you, sir?
Doing well.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah. Just a side note, my personal home was a casualty to that COVID. They can't get their financing now because she's not going to get back pay.
Oh, okay.
That's
So
not
this was a home that you personally own that people were buying?
Right.
Okay.
It actually qualified for the loan. We're set up for closing, and then she was informed almost the same day they were going to be laid off for at least 2 weeks.
Wow.
And the lender at that time was willing to work with her. And then about a week later, their employer told her, no, they're laid off for at least till the end of May now, and they're not going to get back pay. So the not getting the back pay messed up her ratio.
Okay, so a question I have, in that transaction, I don't know how long it's been a contract, so you might have entered a contract before the COVID-19 addendum came out. Did you use that? Did the buyer use that addendum?
No, we didn't use that addendum. We did extend the closing time by 3 weeks.
Okay, and did the buyer have an agent?
Yes.
Okay, okay. So if this, when did this first become a contract? How long ago?
Oh, it
Early
was
March?
No, it was actually like February 20th or so.
Okay, well, that was before the addendum came out, so they wouldn't have known to have used it then.
Right.
That's one of our little bit of our challenges, and we talked about that in our recent class we did, and I'll talk briefly about it tomorrow in our 4:30 call. Well, I'll talk a little bit about the COVID things. Looks like we have Joe Flores has joined us.
There's Joe. I saw him.
Hello, Joe.
Today.
You did who? What?
I saw a new listing from Joe today.
Oh, really? Okay. You mean he's actually out working?
I think so. It was a new listing in Plano with a nice big pool.
Yes,
Ooh.
it is. It went live
Joe?
today.
How are you, sir?
Doing good, sir. How about yourself?
Good. So this is a listing in Plano.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Well, that's good. A little easier to deal with properties in Plano than if it were down in Dallas. So that's good.
Yeah, it's only like maybe 8 minutes away from the office.
Okay. Well, that's good. And we'll follow all the good showing guidelines and all those kinds of things.
Yes, sir. Aaron
That'll
was
be good.
instrumental in helping me with the showing instructions.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, as a coach person, you're really right on top of that to help your people understand how to do all this.
That is correct, sir.
How's your sweet boss, Denise? How is she doing down at DPR? Are they going crazy down there, or are they pretty much trying to handle things like we are?
Actually, her and I were on the phone, and she can hear you.
Hmm.
Hear her?
Hello, Denise. How's it going down there?
It's going okay.
Okay. Of course, you're a little closer to Dallas County, so you got to follow some of those rules.
Yes, absolutely. And
Yeah.
I'm a monitor.
She's a safety monitor.
So, yeah, are you the official COVID-19 czar in your office, Denise?
Yes, sir.
Well, that's good. So if we've got any serious questions, we know who to call.
Call you.
That's a good thing, because I think in most offices it's the MCA. In some of the smaller offices, it might be the team leader or whatever. But I think probably most offices it probably is the MCA. And
Yes, I
because
believe
we've
so.
got such a, have you met our new MCA in Rockwall yet?
No, I have not. Who is it?
Okay. Yeah, Jennifer Shannon. She doesn't have any Keller Williams experience at all, but she seems very sharp, and Dana is very very happy about it. So because she's so new, I don't think she's probably not our COVID-19 czar there. Probably will be Dana, but we'll have to see. Make that decision. I'm not sure if our MCA here in Plano has accepted the position. Maybe Julia can be our COVID-19 czar. Maybe we can have her as our official COVID-19 person.
I
I
don't know
vote for
about
that.
that.
I vote for that.
Yeah, So you got all the votes there, right there, not a problem. And, okay, Marianne, and did I see Lori show up?
No,
And
no,
there's-
it's not on yet.
I thought I saw her name. And then Marianne, how are you, girl?
Hi.
Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. We got a few people here. Did you get the handout and the contract that we sent out to everyone? Did all of you get that?
Is it in our email?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, Julie, the other J here, sent all that out, sent that out to everyone, and it's a handout, ones that we use in all of these 101 classes, but it also was a copy of the 1 to 4 family contract, because that's what we're going to talk about, our select paragraphs from that,
This is true.
and work through that. So we got Joe and Marianne, you got James. Looks like we got 14 people. So Michelle, Jeannie, Carly, okay, and Desmond, Carlos, Christina, Janice. Okay. Well, it's 1:33, and I think we can get started. Can everybody hear me okay? Because I'm working through the microphone on my laptop. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Yep.
yes.
Okay.
Yes, Mr. Bucks.
Okay. So what I would like for us to be able to do as we go through all this is relating to the handout, which is right here. I've got 7 paragraphs, not the first 7 paragraphs in the contract, but throughout the contract, some 7 paragraphs that are dealing with issues that we find ourselves encountering right now that we can go into in depth. And for each paragraph, we start off talking about a purpose. And so I'm going to ask you, so I need for you to be able to know how to, keep yourself muted to cut down on the background noises. But when I ask the question, I really want to get some good participation. It's like we do in a normal class. And we're finding this is working out really well with Zoom. So as we go through this, really feel really comfortable unmuting yourself, asking questions. Does everybody also know how to use the chat, where we got the chat thing there, where you can make use and put things up in chat? So, and maybe Julia will kind of keep an eye on the chat and see if we have questions there that we need to talk about, work through it. So if we're semi-ready, it's 1:35. Yeah, 1:35 now. So the first paragraph that I want to talk about, we're in this by just choosing a few paragraphs and not the whole contract. It lets us get a little bit more in depth with what we're dealing with here. And the first paragraph is paragraph 1, parties. And, I want us to talk about the purpose of this paragraph. And I talk about this in the classes and so, you may have a little bit of an idea or a good sense on it. So let me go ahead as you want to unmute yourself, because my question is you have an idea of what the purpose of paragraph 1 is, go ahead and chime in, and we can, each of us kind of help each other out with ideas that we have here. And you know how I feel like we all learn from everybody else. Anybody have any ideas about what they think some of the purposes of paragraph 1 are?
To clearly identify who is involved in the contract,
Okay.
who the
Okay.
parties are.
Okay. So who the parties are, who is involved in the contract, and Christina, that's a very good. And when we get down to the variables, we're going to see how there's more to it than that. But that is one of the purposes, is that we identify who the parties to the contract are. And one of the things that flows from that is that the reality is the 2 parties, and it doesn't matter how many people there are only 2 parties. There's a seller and a buyer. You could have 7 sellers and 20 buyers. It doesn't matter. But you have 2 parties, seller and a buyer. And those are the only people in the entire world who have any rights or responsibilities under the terms of the contract. Nobody else counts according to the terms of the contract. Now, the problem with that is if all of the non-parties who are not in the contract, if they don't perform, this thing's not going to close, such as us, the agents, the title company, the lender, the inspectors, the appraisers. All of these other people are not parties to the contract, but they have things that need to be done. And if they don't do them, it's not going to close. But the reality is nothing in the contract can make them do anything. So we have no control in the terms of the contract. So Christina's right. That's one of the first purposes. There are actually two more. Anybody have any ideas about what other purposes there might be in paragraph 1? Yeah, Bob, but I'd just be guessing if I had something. No. So let me help you as I might. Okay. One of the things that we do in paragraph 1 is we not only name the parties, we define them. When we put a name in that first blank, and then after that first blank, we have in parentheses the word seller, capitalized word seller. We have now defined who that is. And in the second blank, when we put names in the second blank, followed by, in parentheses, the capitalized word buyer, we've defined who the buyer is. So elsewhere in the contract, we don't have to repeat those names again. We just put the capitalized word seller, capitalized word buyer, and we know exactly who that is. So we have actually defined it. We'll see in the contract, there are a number of places, and we'll see it. We're not going to do this paragraph today, but we'll see in paragraph 2, the very first sentence in paragraph 2 defines the property. So nowhere else in the contract we have to put the legal description and the address again. All we have to use is a capitalized word property, and we know exactly what that is because we define in paragraph 2. So the definition is very important. Now, the third purpose, which is doesn't automatically jump out until you really kind of think through it. There's some promises made by seller and buyer in this first paragraph. The seller agrees to sell and the buyer agrees to buy. And we will see how paragraphs interact, and these promises by the seller and the buyer become the consideration for the contract. It's one of the reasons we don't have to have earnest money if the parties don't want to, because we've got this exchange of something of value, promises where seller promised sell and convey. And in paragraph 9B1, we see how the seller does that by conveying a general warranty deed, and the buyer agrees to buy. And in 9B2, we see how the buyer does that by moving forward and bringing good funds except for the escrow agent. So we've identified the parties, we've defined the parties, and we see the promises the seller's making, the buyer's making. This is the heart of everything else that happens in the contract. One of our great challenges is we enter into a contract, we help our client, buyer or seller, and they enter into a contract with the other party, and they make promises. And what we've really got is a buyer who says, I'd like to buy this house. And the seller says, well, I'd like to sell this house. And then they agree on the terms of how that happens and when that happens and all those conditions elsewhere in the contract. But the real key is we hope this thing moves forward in a way that the seller still wants to sell and the buyer still wants to buy. And if in fact that happens, it's our job to make sure it happens according to the terms of the contract that the buyer and seller agree to. This is one of those things, there's a lot of trust involved in a contract, because the reality is if either side decides at any point in time to stop and not move forward and not do what they promised to, if either side does it, seller or buyer, doesn't matter, nothing automatically happens. That's why we got a paragraph 15, a default paragraph that says, if the other party defaults, here are your options. Here are your 3 things you can do. But the reality is we're hoping the parties still want to do what they promised. And this starts with paragraph 1 with the big promise. Seller says, I promise to sell. Buyer says, I promise to buy. And it's our job to make sure everything else happens so seller can sell and buyer can buy. Does that make sense? Are we kind of good with that? Are you ready for the variables? Because in your handout, do many of you have your handout there? Do you have the handout? Do any of you have the handout? Okay, so let me just tell you. So if you got a piece of paper there, we just talked about purpose, the variables in paragraph 1. And so if you just got a piece of paper, you can write this out as we deal with it. Your first set of variables deals with the seller and who the seller is. First thing, and I kind of joke about this in classes, when you're out on a listing and you're talking to the person who allegedly owns the property and is going to sell it, you almost need to say to that seller, what causes you to think that you own this property and have a right to convey title? Because the hard reality is not all people who think they can sell, in fact, legally really can sell. There may be a lot of variables. So some of the variables that come into play is who the seller is. The seller may be someone who has inherited the property, but they haven't yet totally inherited it. Maybe it's in probate. It may be a corporation, and they need a corporate resolution to determine, in fact, whether or not the corporation has given that person the authority to convey title to some of the corporation's property. We see this a lot with investors and dealing with LLCs where they bought the property and they're going to rehab it and sell it. And they need to have something for the title company to say, yeah, we've got the authority to do that. So there are a lot of variables in who the seller is. If the seller is a trust, we may have a trustee that's dealing with that's going to sign off on it. If it's a trust and there's a beneficiary involved, then the terms of the trust must give that beneficiary the authority to do that. If it's being sold in an estate and there's a will there or not a will that's been through probate, and we have a independent heirship affidavits, or we have an administrator appointed by the court to sell, all of those are variables, but we need to make sure if we're representing a seller, that when we put whatever name we put in paragraph 1, that the reality is that's someone who has the authority to come to the title company and convey this title. And remember, we're not going to be the one who creates the problems. We're going to say, well, here's what the title company needs. The title company needs the will. The title company needs the trust. The title company needs the resolution from the corporation. The title company needs to see the order from the probate court giving you the authority to convey title as an executor or an administrator. And the reality is that's not just a way to get around, not answering the question, but the reality, it is the title company who's the final bottom line says, yeah, we've got to have this. We've got to do this. So as you go through it, that's your first big variable on the seller. The other thing is making sure if the seller, as in most cases, most of the time, 60% of the time, the seller is really an individual or a couple of individuals who are selling their home. We just need to make sure that the name we put for them is in fact a name that's good legal name, probably the name that's on the deed. So when they come to closing, the title company can clearly identify these are the people who in fact have the authority, because the title company would have put together a commitment to make sure these people can in fact do this. So we need to make sure. So that's your big variables on that. Any questions on the first variables dealing with the seller? Any questions on that?
Bob, one of the things that I do for when I have my client is to prepare the contract using the name on their driver's license. Is that typically the best?
It's probably not a bad practice. So what you're saying is she's using the name on their driver's license, which probably is their legal name, and it's probably the name on their deed. However, by doing this, what you're also probably doing, maybe even unintentionally, is finding out, is this how they own the property? They may own the property in a different name. They may own the property in a trust or a corporation or some other name. And by asking them for a driver's license and explain to them what you're going to do with this, all of a sudden you're helping them understand, oh, well, actually, well, that's my legal name. Here's the name we have on the deed. And then you'll know, because the name on the deed is what the title company is going to want to see in the contract.
Is the name on the deed typically going to be what we find on the tax records when we print the tax records?
Most of the time. Sometimes the name on the tax record is not a complete name. And what the title company is going to want it is as complete a name as possible, not a first name, middle initial, last name, but a complete name. So this, as you go through this process, this gets you started down the road of making sure you can get some really good information and also help your client understand the reason why we're going through this to make sure no surprises at closing. How are you doing with your coworker there?
Oh, he just,
coworker there.
just woke up in time for the meeting.
Me too. We all got up just in time. That's great. Okay, is everybody good with the variables on the seller side? Everybody kind of see where we are with that? Now let's go to the buyer side. On the buyer side, again, in paragraph 1, seller and buyer, we want good, complete names. We want to give the title company the best chance they can have of really identifying who these people are. On the buyer side, it's okay to have a conversation with your buyer and say, how would you like your name to appear on the deed? But the real question on the buyer side is whether there's financing or not. If the buyers are obtaining financing, then it's going to come down to a conversation with the buyer's lender, because the buyer's lender is going to want to have the exact same name in the contract as will be on the loan, and be on the promissory note, be on the deed of trust. And so it's going to totally be a buyer-lender conversation. If it's a cash transaction, the buyer can literally use anything you want, although we want good legal names so the title company can figure out who these people are. The big thing for the buyer in a cash transaction, because they've got more flexibility in how they take title, if they're going to take title in a name that's maybe other than their exact legal name on the passport and driver's license, they need to understand that when they get ready to sell the property later, they may have a challenge proving up, in fact, this is who they really are. So they want to be a little careful as they get creative and move beyond their exact legal name as they work through that. Does that kind of semi make sense? Everybody's good with that? Okay. Any other variables, any other things that you want to come up with and say, well, Bob, what about? And then this would be a good time to come up with that whatever. Or does everybody say, well, so far, Bob, we're okay. So far, I'm good. Anybody have anything?
One more question, Bob. I'm
Okay.
sorry. For heir relationship, a deceased person, when it's being covered by a power of attorney or an executor or executrix, does it just have the name of the individual who's deceased, if in that case, or does it have so and so as executor for? Okay,
so when we're talking about sellers, which is where we are with this, power of attorney won't come into play for a deceased person.
Yeah,
but for anybody else, someone who is an executor, someone who is operating on that. Now, you may have a seller who's operating under power of attorney, not for a deceased person, but for a parent that they have, but you're helping sell the house and they're no longer mentally incompetent, no longer mentally, that's why they're operating on the POA, or it's just more convenient. The key is you go ahead and actually put the name of the seller in paragraph 1, and then the person signs that person name on paragraph 8, and then beside it, their name as POA, as power of attorney. That way they've identified that they are the power of attorney. They would do this same thing if they're operating as an executor. They would have the name of the estate in paragraph 1, the estate of Marion, Jimmy Moore, whatever, and then they would sign their name on page 8 where you have signatures and identify as the executor or executrix if it's a lady person. So you would do it in that manner. Does that make semi-good sense?
Yes, thank you.
And I noticed a number of people who've asking for people to forward them the handout. Hopefully that you've been able to do that and people have it now a little bit better as we work through it. Okay, so let's go into the next paragraph I have in the handout is paragraph 5, the earnest money paragraph. And it's interesting. We've developed some challenges for a number of different reasons. And this is truly a very basic Contracts 101 concept that we really need to have a very comfortable feeling in dealing with the earnest money issue. The challenge is not how much is the earnest money. We know the concept, deal with that. The challenge is we as agents need to make sure our client, first of all, if you've got the buyer needs to understand they're going to write a check or in some way pay money to a title company. And when they do that, they've given control of that money to that title company. Now, we'll help our client understand, because we go through these cycles, and recently we run into some real challenges with release of earnest money. And we're having people get very unhappy with the fact that they think they should get the earnest money because they look at the contract, and the contract seems to be very clear. Yeah, if this doesn't happen, I get the earnest money. Buyer or seller, most of the time, most of the language in the contract says if the buyer in fact terminates under any of their rights of termination, they get the earnest money. So the buyer says, well, it's pretty clear. So on the earnest money issue, the first thing is we need to be clear. The purpose of this paragraph is the buyer, in fact, putting some good faith money up with a neutral third party, i.e. the title company, and saying to the seller, I'm serious about buying your house for $300,000, and I'm putting $3,000 up with the title company to show you I'm serious. So it's okay for you, the seller, to take the risk and take your house off the market because I'm serious. And here's some earnest money showing you that's the case. And so that's the really purpose, to say, here's the amount of the money, here's the neutral third party, i.e. title company, that's going to be holding this, and here's how that works. Where we run into a challenge is make sure we understand what happens if this contract goes awry in some manner and is not going to close. It doesn't matter which side is in default. What we've got to do is look at, first of all, when we look at any situation where the question is a release of earnest money, we've got to help the buyer, for example, understand we do not have the earnest money. Who has the earnest money? Title company. We talked about at the very beginning. We look in paragraph 5, we see the amount of the earnest money. We see earnest money to title company. So that's who has it. Now, that becomes very important because when we look at our 3 factors that relate to the release of earnest money, the first factor is, what does the contract say? And if the contract says, if this happens, earnest money is refunded to buyer. Well, that's what the contract says. So we have to look at the contract or an addendum to the contract to see what does it say about the earnest money. The second issue relates to the actions of the parties. We find this in cases in which the buyer and seller have gotten at odds with each other, and the buyer is going to terminate as they feel like they have certain rights to do it. And the most common example is the buyer is going to terminate during the buyer approval time frame in the third-party financing addendum, because the buyer's gotten nervous about financing or whatever, and they say, we want out of the deal. And the buyer looks at paragraph 2A, which talks about buyer approval, and says, well, that's pretty clear. I have a right to terminate during this time frame. It says earnest money is refunded to me. So the buyer says, the contract clearly says I get it. Well, the seller says, no, I don't think so. I had 5 offers. Yours was a good offer. But the reason I accepted your offer is you convinced me you were solid gold as a borrower. There was no way that you wouldn't get approved. There was no way that you wouldn't have your financing, that you were solid gold. And that's why I accepted your offer. And now you're telling me, King's X, I was just kidding. I lied to you. It didn't really count. And you want to earn some money back. So it says, not only am I not going to sign a release, I'm going to sue you. Well, we then so that's the actions of the parties. We get to the third factor, which is really the more important one, and that's what's the policy of the title company. And if the title company hears any rumors of anybody disputing the release of the earnest money, the title company says, this money doesn't go anywhere until everybody signs a release. And even though the contract says to the buyer, hey, this happens, you terminate, you get your earnest money, title company says, nope, doesn't count. And remember, the title company doesn't have to follow the instructions in the contract. They're not a party to it, and they have their own policy. They're a neutral third party, theoretically, and they can sit here and say, yeah, money's not going anywhere until everybody does it. And in some extreme challenges, if the parties can't come to some agreement on what's going to happen, what really ends up happening is that money sits at the title company, and at some point in time, and it can be up to a year, the title company may say, you know what, we're just not willing to let it continue to sit there. We're going to interplead it with the courts. They send the earnest money to the courts. And then what happens then is the action of the courts begin to eat up the amount of the earnest money. And what happens is nobody gets anything, which is why we'll always try to encourage the parties to work something out and go through the process so they can, in fact, can get it. And everybody can get something as worked through it. But we've got to understand that this release of earnest money can be a real challenge. And without creating a huge problem for our client, they need to understand the factors are involved in this earnest money. If it would get to a situation, we don't want to create a problem before it exists, but if it does happen in some way, shape, or form, and we find ourselves in a case where our buyer wants to terminate the contract and wants earnest money, that would be a good time to have a conversation. Say, okay, let's talk about what's going to be involved and who gets to decide what happens to the earnest money. That'd be a good time to have that conversation. Now, the other thing I want to talk about, and please, as I go through this, if you say, whoa, slow down, Bob, I got a question on that, please let me know if you do. Raise your hand or whatever. The other thing is, let's talk about the timing and what happens if the buyer doesn't get the earnest money to the title company within the time frame that is agreed to in the contract. And the time frame is 3 days, and it's 3 calendar days. And what happens is, because we've got language in paragraph 5 that says, you know, if the 3rd day falls on a weekend or legal holiday, we go to the next day that's not a weekend or legal holiday. But the way we get to the 3 days, the way we get to the 3rd day is calendar days. So if we have a contract and the effective day of the contract is a Wednesday, the 1st day is Thursday, the 2nd day is Friday, the 3rd day is Saturday. Oops, that's a weekend. And so that would take us for that purposes to Monday, unless Monday's a holiday, then we go to Tuesday. So, but we get to that 3rd day by calendar days. Now, and this is really important to understand. When the buyer has not gotten the earnest money to the title company in the time required, let's say our contract was on a Monday, so Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, so we're not on a weekend or whatever, but the buyer, for whatever reason, doesn't get the earnest money to the title company by that 3rd day. We need to be clear. Nothing automatically happens. Contract doesn't terminate. Nobody's in default. The seller can take their sweet time and say, you know, I understand with everything else going on, it takes a little bit longer, and I understand why the buyer hadn't done it yet, but I'm pretty confident they're going to, so I'm okay with it. Seller can continue to hold off. We may be 5, 6, 7 days into the transaction, and the buyer still doesn't have the earnest money to the title company, but the seller can say, yeah, I'm okay, I'm good with waiting, not a problem. But at some point in time, after that 3rd day, after that timeline, seller says, you know, I don't think I want to wait anymore. I'm going to terminate this contract. Maybe the seller got another offer in, and they want to get rid of this first buyer who doesn't seem to be able to perform. They want to go to another buyer. At that point in time, and it's in the seller termination of contract, which is a direct form, at that point in time, the seller can terminate the contract by sending notice to the buyer and to the title company. Now, they have to do that before the buyer finally gets the earnest money to the title company. So if it's that 3rd day, at a Thursday, and it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and the seller is going to go ahead and send that termination notice, but oops, unbeknownst to us, the buyer finally got their act together, and 11 o'clock that morning got the earnest money to the title company, seller can no longer terminate, because they had to do it before the buyer got the earnest money, even though it was past the 3 days. So we need to stay on top of the timelines as you work through and dealing with that, which means in today's environment, coronavirus environment, if you've got the buyer, you need to make sure you've coordinated with the title company on access to the title company and getting that earnest money to them. Some of them have different rules about access to it, different hours, so you need to make sure that you work through that. Questions on that? Questions on paragraph 5? Anyone good? Anyone say, oh, wait a minute, Bob, I didn't realize that was the rule.
If the money has been taken to the title company, but nobody has been notified yet, what happens then?
Well, when the money is taken to the title company will receive the earnest money.
Right.
And there will be a date, and the title companies now are not only putting a date, but a time.
Okay.
And so that will determine, when that's done, that'll determine whether the seller still has a right or not.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, makes sense? Okay,
Yeah.
Good question. Okay, are we ready to go to paragraph? The next one on my handout is paragraph 6, specifically paragraph 6C, which deals with a survey. Everybody ready to do that? Say yes, Bob. Okay, so here's the deal. Paragraph 6C, the purpose of 6C is for the buyer and the seller to make a choice relating to the survey. And there are 3 choices. 6C1 is where the buyer and the seller say, okay, we're going to use an existing survey. 6C2, buyer and seller agree that the buyer is going to obtain a survey and the buyer is going to pay for it. 6C3, the seller says, I'll get the survey for the buyer and I'll pay for it. So we'll first look at 6C1 and look at the purpose of what's going on in 6C1, dealing specifically with an existing survey. Now, we need to keep in mind, because this is a 101 class, and I need to make sure everybody remembers something that you've heard me say 17 or 18 or 20 times. But the reason I keep saying it is sometimes we forget maybe. If we represent a buyer, we want the buyer to get a new survey. We always want to advise the buyer to get a new survey. That's our advice. They can do whatever they want to do. And the reality is about easily 70 to 80% of the time, the buyer's going to want a new survey. Want an existing survey. They want to save a few bucks when you use an existing survey. Even when we've had the buyer, even after looking at the seller's disclosure notice, and in the seller's disclosure notice where we ask the seller, you got a survey? He says, nope, don't have one. Buyer still makes an offer 6C1, which is kind of silly, but anyway, they do it. So in spite of our good advice, buyer says, I want to use this existing survey, and the purpose of this paragraph is to determine the timing on the survey and the T47, and when the seller needs to do that, and then a choice we've got towards the end of 6C1. Now, 6C1 is a little bit of a challenging paragraph. When I served on Trex Broker Lawyer Committee for 6 years, during that 6 years, we changed the wording in 6C1 twice during that 6-year period. Since then, they've changed it again because what we thought was clear to everybody, we got feedback on Broker Lawyer Committee. We got feedback from the field saying, we think you know what you said here, but nobody else agrees with it. So explain it one more time. So we do have some challenges, and we'll see, because what we do in paragraph 6C1 is we've got some requirements at the beginning of the paragraph and some consequences, and then we got some choices in the paragraph. And people sometimes don't read through the whole paragraph, and they get those confused at some level. So at the beginning in 6C1, we've got a seller agreeing within a certain time frame. You got a blank there, and typically that's going to be a fairly short time frame. 5 days is a typical time frame that I see. But whatever the time frame is, the seller agrees in that time frame to deliver both the existing survey and the T47, which is a notarized affidavit, delivers both of those to the title company, to the buyer and the title company. The seller agrees to do both of those. Now, the T47, the only time a T47 is ever used is an existing survey. And it has to be notarized. We've had a challenge with some title companies. We see this more in smaller title companies or fee attorney offices where they say, oh, we just notarize that at closing. That's too late. It's got to be done within this time frame. And it's not an affidavit if it's not notarized. That's a requirement for it to be an affidavit. So within that time frame, seller has to do both of those. Now, in bold print, and we put it in bold print to try to emphasize what we're really talking about. If the seller doesn't do both of those, if he doesn't do either one of those in the time frame, buyer gets a new survey and seller pays for it. Now, your variable here, frankly, comes down to ordering up the new survey and the title company and who's keeping track of it, because you've got 5 days in there and you're on the 6th day and you represent the buyer. So you now know, based on what's agreed to in paragraph 6C1, you now know the buyer now has a right to a new survey and the seller's going to pay for it. I mean, that's what's been agreed to in the contract. You've got some variables dealing with that issue. Before you jump up and down and get all excited about, oh boy, new survey, and call the title company and say, order up that survey right now and the seller's going to pay for it. Look at what's going on in the transaction. Look at what you're still negotiating. Look if you're going to have, if you've had an inspection and you've got a ton of repairs and you know that you're going to have a really tough repair negotiating situation, you may not want to rock the boat right now over a survey. Now, it's the buyer's decision. Buyer says, well, you know what, let's work out the repair issue first, and then we'll see what we need to do about the survey. Now, part of that's the timing of the contract. How long is it? If it's a 45-day closing, you've got plenty of time to still work through the survey issue. But look at what else is going on in the transaction to see, in fact, if you really want to do something there or not. The other thing is, if the buyer says, oh, good, okay, we didn't get it in time, so I get a new survey, seller's going to pay for it, you need to coordinate that with the title company. You need to make sure 2 things. 1, they are going to order up a new survey, and 2, they're going to charge the seller for it. Because sometimes your buyer, to get their offer accepted, to make it an attractive offer to a seller, use the seller's title company. Well, we know whose title company really is. It's the listing agents. And the title company may be reluctant to rock the boat with this listing agent who they do a lot of business with, a ton of business. And they say, well, why don't, buyer's agent, before we order up a new survey, why don't you talk to the listing agent and make sure you got this worked out? So you need to talk to the title company. You need to see what's going to be done. You need to make sure not only are they going to order up a new survey, but they're going to charge the seller for it, because that's what's agreed to in the contract. Questions on that part before I go to the choices at the end of this paragraph 61? Is everybody good?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Now, as you'll notice, towards the end of paragraph 61, you got 2 boxes. These 2 boxes get confused with the requirement of what the sellers agreed to do at the beginning of this paragraph. These 2 boxes only come into play in one set of circumstances. The seller has complied. He produced the executive survey and he produced the T47 affidavit within the time in that blank in 6C1. But what he produced, either one, the survey or the affidavit, was not found to be acceptable. And if it's not found to be acceptable under paragraph 6C1, a title company or the buyer's lender, then the buyer gets a new survey, and we look at these 2 boxes to see who's going to pay for the new survey. Could be the seller, could be the buyer. That's negotiable. When the offer was written, when this became a contract, a choice was made there, and a choice does need to be made there. So if that were to happen, who's going to pay for the new survey? And I find most of the time, to me, unless the buyer has a very, very weak negotiating position, I like the idea of having the seller pay for it, because frankly, I think they played a game with us from day one. They had an existing survey, and they knew it had no chance of being approved, and say, hey, I got one, here it is, let's see what happens. So I think if it doesn't work out, I think the seller ought to pay for a new survey, but that's negotiable. So we go through that process. So if you do this, if you get to this point and the buyer's going to have a new survey, and by the way, if the buyer's going to get a new survey under paragraph 6C1, he has to get it no later than 3 days prior to closing. So we need to make sure that happens. But you're going to have to talk to the title company and say, okay, this was not acceptable to the buyer's lender. Certainly if it's not acceptable to the title company, they already know. And you need to make sure the title company does order up a new survey and the time frame works, and that they order up this certain new survey and that the seller's going to pay for, and that whoever has their box checked off is going to pay for it. Does that make semi-sense? Questions on that so far? Semi good? I want to give you time to unmute yourself, because wake up and unmute yourself and be able to participate, because remember, we all learn from each other as we kind of go through this. We good? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So,
Yes, question.
yes. So if you're selecting one, let me make sure I'm clear on this. If you're selecting one, you can still also select 2 or 3, not both, to determine if it didn't meet the lender's requirements.
6C2 or 6C3?
6C2 or 6C3.
No, these are mutually exclusive. If you check 6C1, you don't do anything in 2 or 3. 2 and 3 don't have anything to do with what's agreed to in 1. The way we determine who's going to pay for a new survey is whose box is checked in 6C1. You don't go down to 2 or 3. It's all inclusive within 6C1.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. We good? Okay.
Do you want to go over survey deletion again?
Oh, but you want to move back up on this same page to paragraph 6A8?
Yeah, just make sure.
Sure. Okay. Is everybody good with us doing that a little bit? I certainly want to respond to your needs, and I've said in the email, if you have something that's in other paragraphs, we can certainly talk about it. So while everybody, hopefully you have the contract, and on that same page where we have the survey choices, up above you have paragraph 6A8.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, these 9 paragraphs up here in paragraph 6A, these are all things that the title company is saying to the buyer. You have no coverage for any of these items. These are standard exceptions. Number 8 relates to the survey. And what number 8 does is it has language that allows the buyer who's going to obtain the title policy to amend this exception. We tend to call it survey deletion. What it really is an amendment to the standard exception relating to a survey. So what this does is you'll see in 6A8, the standard print exception, and it talks about what it is: discrepancies, conflicts, shortages in area, boundary lines, encroachments, protrusions, overlapping improvements. Those are all standard exception. If you look at your title insurance policy, if you didn't do any amendment, when you go into the exceptions, you go into the exclusions, you'll see this is a standard exception. You'll see all those things listed. Now, if the buyer chose to amend, and under 6A8, you've got 2 choices, I and double I. And so if you choose the second one that says it will be amended, then when you go to your title policy and you look under these standard exceptions, all the rest of it will go away with exception for the phrase that will still remain is shortages in area, which relates to the exact square footage of the land. So what the title company is saying, if your problem is there's a mistake in the survey and there's a conflict in the boundary, if there's an encroachment, something like that, if that's the problem and you've amended it, file a claim. But if your problem is you thought you bought a house on an acre, turns out it wasn't an acre, it was less than an acre, and that's your problem, guess what? We can't help you. That's still an exception. You have no coverage for shortages in area. Now, so if your buyer is obtaining an existing survey, you would always want them to amend this exception. Because if your buyer has a boundary conflict, or your buyer has an encroachment with the next door neighbor because of a mistake on the survey, and he did not amend it, and he has an existing survey, he has nowhere to go.
Right. Okay.
He has no recourse against the surveyor. But if he's amended it, he can file a claim with the title company unless the problem is how many square feet are in the land. If he doesn't have that, then he's just out of luck.
Okay. I get it.
That makes semi-sense. Everybody good with that? Kind of? Okay. So back into the handouts, back in paragraph 6C, paragraph 6C2. So, and I did say I want to kind of amend a statement I just made in relationship to question Christina. 6C1, 6C2, and 6C3 are essentially mutually exclusive. You choose one of the three. The time in which you might choose two of them is the buyer and the seller say, we're going to split the cost of a new survey. In which case you could check off 6C2 and 6C3, but you would also put language in paragraph 11, special provisions, buyer and seller agree to share equally in the cost of a new survey. So that's the only time that you would actually check off more than one choice in paragraph 6C. Does that make sense? Good with that? Okay, now 6C2, buyer, and by the way, I think most of the time, ideally, 6C2 is the best choice for a buyer. They're getting a new survey and they're paying for it. I think that's the best. They've created a really good offer for a seller. They've done a really good job there. And I think that's what they should do. Hello, Max. He's back here behind Julia. There's Max. Wave at us, Max. Anyway, so 6C2, I like the buyer getting a new survey. Now, you've got a couple things, a couple of variables that are going on with paragraph 6C2. You got to blank for a number of days. The concept, the variable for the buyer, they don't want to order up a new survey until they know this deal is looking really good. Because once you order up a survey and it's done, you owe for it, whether the deal closes or not. So the buyer's going to say, well, I at least want to get through the option period. So I'm going to at least wait past that 10-day option period. And you know what? I think I'm going to also make sure I've got buyer approval done. So I've got a 15-day time frame for financing. So I don't think I want to order up another survey until about 20 days down the road. That's a more reasonable time frame, because then the buyer, no guarantees, but the buyer says, this contract, this transaction is looking good. It's probably going to close. So I probably don't have a risk of paying for a survey on a house that I'm not going to buy. So the time frame in 6C2 for the buyer is going to be a longer time frame. I mean, probably about 20 days or so. Now, there's important language in the last sentence in 6C2 that relates to paragraph 6D, which is an objection paragraph, which we're going to talk about. But look at the last sentence in paragraph 6C2. Buyer is deemed to receive the survey on the date of actual receipt or the date specified in this paragraph, whichever is earlier. So if the buyer were to put 10 days in 6C2, but he's not sure how the deal's looking, so he says, I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait for 15 days or maybe 20 days, and he doesn't really get the survey till 15 days after the effective date of the contract. And then he goes down into paragraph 6D, and he says, well, my objection time frame in 6D, I got a blank here for a number of days, which we'll talk about in a minute, but that's tied to the receipt of the last of three pieces of information: commitment, exception documents, and survey. Well, I didn't get the survey until 15 days after the effective date, so I've got 5 days from that 15 days. No. If you've got 10 days in 6C2, the earlier of the number of days or when you received it, that's what's going to tie into your objection time frame. So the buyer needs to know they don't get that extra fudging room by just delaying getting the survey if they've got a shorter time frame in 6C2. So they need to make sure they see how those two interact. Now, if a buyer has a really good negotiating position, your buyer's the first warm body to show up in 6 months, the seller just hopes they buy the house, then you probably are in a better negotiating position. And 6C3 is certainly a good choice for the buyer. They say, I want a new survey and I want the seller to pay for it. Now, the number of days in 6C3 is a little bit less important than the number of days in 6C2. If the deal falls apart the seller's got a virtually new survey he can probably use with the next buyer. But the seller is at least probably going to want to get through the option period. So if you've got a 10-day option period, the seller's going to want probably at least 12 days in 6C3. So they're going to have a different time frame, not as long a time frame as the buyer wants in 6C2, but certainly probably want to get past an option period. So we got a 7-day option period. They may well just put 10 days in 6C3. We good with that? So we good with 6C1, 2, and 3? Everybody nod their head and say, yes, Bob, we're so on top of that.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Okay, so, hello, Charlie. So we look at 6D. Now, there's a really important point in 6D that I need for us to understand. The purpose of 6D is to set up a basis for objection that the buyer may have relating to those items that are identified in that first part of 6D when they get title commitment, exception documents, and survey. And so this sets up the basis and the timing for a buyer's objection. The first thing is really important for you to understand. Buyer just doesn't have a right to object to anything. Because when you look at the language in 6D, in the first part of the paragraph, buyer may object in writing to defects, exceptions, encumbrances title disclosed in the survey, other than items 6A 1 through 7 above, or other than items 6A 1 through 9, the commitment. So there are some limitations on what the buyer can object to. And where we normally find this coming into play, when you look at the exceptions, and you can go to the top of this page, exception number 4 are utility easements. Sometimes a buyer wants to buy a house, big backyard, they want to build an in-ground pool. And they discover after they get commitments and surveys that there are easements running through the backyard, and that's going to get in the way of them building an in-ground pool. And they don't have the right to object to easements, it says so in that first part of it, unless in the big blank, they put something in there that creates a basis for objection, such as they want to build an in-ground pool, a big in-ground pool, and they can describe it. And the more detailed you are in your description, I want a 30 by 90, Olympic size in-ground pool, I want it done here. When the buyer puts that in that paragraph, it creates a right for the buyer to object. Now, the reason I'm taking this really slowly, it does not create any obligation on the part of the seller to be concerned with this. There's no action required on the seller's part. And we're going to see that in the language under the little blank in 6D. It's totally a right for the buyer. So if the buyer puts something in there where he wants to build an in-ground pool, it's the buyer's responsibility to check out and see if there are things that are going to get in the way of him building an in-ground pool. Because the reality is, when the buyer puts something in the big blank, they've created a basis for objection they otherwise would not have. So you need to have that conversation with your buyer and say, tell me, let's talk about some things you want to do with the property. You want to build a detached garage, want to put a command in the back, big storage, and are there some problems that once we get all this information that creates a problem with doing that? If there are, this creates a right for you to object, but it's totally, entirely, completely the responsibility of the buyer. The responsibility of the buyer's agent is to let your buyer know, okay, we've taken step 1. We put in here that you want to build an in-ground pool. Step 2 is you need to get all the information that could cause you to be able to do that or not be able to do it. And then you, the buyer, before closing, you need to make whatever objection you want to make within the timeline that you have in the small blank, make the objection and see what the seller will do about it. It's not the responsibility of the seller to worry about this. It's the buyer's responsibility, which means it's the buyer's agent responsibility to say, buyer, we've taken step 1. Step 2 is you've got to determine, can I do what I want to do here? If I can't, then I object. And if a seller can't or won't cure it, then the buyer has the right to terminate the contract, not close on it, and get his earnest money back. But if you see the level of responsibility where it is here, just putting something in there doesn't automatically make the seller say, well, wait, I see you want to build an in-ground pool. I don't think you're going to be able to do that. Setback lines, easements, all kinds of things in the way. That's not the responsibility of the seller to tell the buyer that. It's the responsibility of the buyer to check it out. So whatever you put in this thing creates a basis for your buyer, but no obligation on the seller. Does that make sense so far? Kind of good with that? Now, here's the other side of when you put something in the big blank. Don't just put something in there to be sticking something in there. It clouds the offer. The seller's going to look at this as an easy way for a buyer to get out of the deal. So if the buyer says, well, I want to sell Amway products out of my garage, or I want to run a daycare center, or I want a business out of the home. If they put things in there, one that are vague, that create challenges, the seller may say, wow, that's a weasel clause, or you're just looking for an easy way to get out of the deal, and it could really cloud the offer and affect the seller accepting your buyer's offer. So the buyer should only put something in there that's really important to the buyer, and the buyer says, if I don't get to do this thing, and I understand it's my responsibility buyer to make sure before I close on it where I can or cannot do that. The buyer may say, if I don't get to do this thing, then I may not buy the house. I can object, and if we can't fix the problem, I can terminate and get my earnest money back. Now, the buyer may object, and then if it can't be fixed, the buyer may say, I kind of wanted to do this, but push come to shove, I love this house so much. I love the area. I'm going to buy this house anyway, even though I can't run a business out of the garage. So I'm still going to buy the house. Buyer gets to make that decision, but they do it after they've created a basis for objection and gone through the process. And so you put something very specific, very detailed, but understand how it could cloud the offer. Because if a seller's looking at 5 offers and yours is 1, and the other 4 don't have anything in paragraph 6D in the big blank, then the seller's going to look at the other offers as maybe being more attractive than your buyer's offer. Now, the small blank beneath the big blank. The small blank is usually a fairly short period of time, 3 days, 5 days, and it's how much time the buyer needs to object. Because the time frame, and this is one of those time frames where it's not tied to the effective date of the contract, it's tied to an event. And the number of days in the small blank in 6D is tied to the buyer's receipt of the last of the 3 documents: commitment, accepting your documents, and survey. Excuse me. So it's tied to that, or closing, whichever comes earlier. The buyer does not get to extend the closing date for the right of objection. So if the buyer were to get the last of the 3 documents 1 day before closing, he may have 5 days in this blank, but he only has 1 day to object. So the buyer does not get to extend his timeline for objections in this blank, because it's tied to when he receives it or the closing date, whichever is earlier. Good with that so far? Now, the flip side of that is the seller. If the buyer makes an objection, and by the way, there is no promulgated form, there's no standard form of that. It can be an email, it can be almost anything from the buyer to the seller. When a buyer makes an objection, the seller has an obligation to cure the objection. He's got 15 days to do it, and the seller can extend the closing date for those 15 days. Now, there's a little kind of a catch-22 in this. When you go down from the small blank, 3 lines down in the middle, it says, provided seller is not obligated to incur any expense, seller shall cure any timely objections. What this says, and it's an intentionally vague term. I mean, we battled with this when I was on the Brook Lawyer Committee, and we couldn't come up with any way to make it more specific. So we said, yeah, seller can't be required to spend any money at all, period. seller could say, well, I could cure this objection. It just would take me mailing the county and that would solve it. Just a little letter and fix it. But stamps have really gotten expensive, and I just don't think I'm going to do that. Doesn't have to. Seller literally doesn't have to expend any expenses at all. So if the seller chooses not to cure the objection, you got 15 days, and that's called a cure period now with the language that we've got in here. And then the buyer has 5 days after that cure period to decide if the objection is really serious and they want to terminate the contract, or they say, you know what, I really would like to do that, but I still like the house. We want to buy the house, and that's what we're going to do. So you need to be comfortable with the timelines tied to the closing date, the days of objection for the buyer, what the seller's timeline is, the seller's lack of requirement to spend any money, the cure period, which is the 15 days, and then the 5 days after that for a buyer to make a decision, because that 5 days after cure period is new. We used to have no time frame, which meant the buyer had all the way to closing to finally decide if they want to do the deal or not. Kind of stretch everybody out. Now, after the cure 15 days, the buyer only has 5 days. They've got to decide or not. And if they don't do anything in 5 days, their right to object is gone. So they've waived and said, yeah, I'm okay with everything. Questions on that? Are we kind of good with that? We are finding ourselves dealing with challenges with the objections. The big challenge is understanding what happens to the contract. We put something in the big blank, and whose side of the transaction is that responsibility on? Not the seller, only the buyer, which means it's also the buyer's agent. And you need to be sure as a buyer's agent, when your buyer puts something in there, then you help your buyer understand, well, once we get all these things, commitment, secondary survey, buyer, you've got to do your due diligence and make sure you can do the thing you want to do or not. If you can't, then buyer, don't close on the house. And that's going to be a buyer decision there. Everybody good? Questions? So and as much as I'm trying to get used to Zoom, and I'm really, as much as I am technology challenged, and you guys are doing a great job, and I'm glad we got Julia here to be the host and help me through this and work through it. One of the hardest things for me in a Zoom, and this is one of several I've done now, is asking questions and taking the time and pausing and giving you the opportunity to unmute yourself, because I don't want to slip past somebody's need to inquire about something and ask a question and work through it. So please, even if we've slipped past something, we're moving on to the next paragraph, please be comfortable and say, whoa, Bob, wait, let's talk about that one more time, like Sally did a bit earlier. So any questions so far? Yes, ma'am.
What do you recommend as an appropriate number of days in the little box under 6D?
Okay, usually about 5 days. The concept of the number of days is when the buyer receives information that relates to their thing that they want to object to. They may need to get past a weekend, maybe even a holiday. They say, well, I need to check with the city, but it's a Friday now. It's late on a Friday, so Monday I'll be able to get with them. So you probably want to at least be able to get through a weekend. So 5 days. If it's more than 5 days, occasionally I see 10 or 15 days. When I see that, it's because they weren't paying attention. The number of days is tied to the receipt of the information, not the effective date. If it's a really long time frame, you'd want to ask the buyer's agent, is there something special going on here that you feel like you need a lot of time for? And you'd want to get that information at that point. Does that answer that? We good?
Thank you.
Hey, Bob, Brian DeLuca. Quick question for
Brian?
you. With regard to 6E, title notices,
Yep.
If my memory serves me right, you had mentioned that that's not in the new build contracts. And
Well, okay, good question. It's not in all builders' contracts.
okay.
And it's a great question, Brian. What he's talking about, this is actually under the rules of TREC, we are required in writing to give this notice to our buyer. Probably about half of the builder contracts out there have it, because many of the builders out there have a broker in their company that puts the properties in MLS. And so they have this in there because that broker needs to do that. Because if they've got a situation where the builder is selling a house to a buyer who doesn't have an agent, then that buyer needs that notice. Although it's not the builder's requirement. If the builder, I think Pulte, for example, has a broker in their company, that broker now is responsible for doing this. It needs to be in their contract. But if you've got a buyer on a new build, look at the builder's contract. And if it's not in there, then we need to, and there's a separate notice that, a consumer notice that TREC has that you can give to your buyer, because you've got to give that written notice to your buyer, either obtain an abstract, opinion from an attorney, or obtain a title policy. We're required by the TREC rules to do that. And depending on what happens to the transaction, it can be a serious violation. If the buyer ends up with some real title problems because they didn't do what they should have recommended because nobody ever told them, there's some real liability there. So good question, Brian. Thank you. Everybody good with that? Can you follow up to that?
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Bob, I have a question.
Yes.
On 6D, back to 6D, you said on the big line, don't cloud that up. If you don't have any issues, leave that blank.
If you don't have anything specific.
Right. The little line beneath it, where you normally would put 5 days, does something have to go there at all times?
Okay. Let me tell you how great a question that is. That's perfect. You always, how often? Always have to have a number of days in the small blank. Whether you have anything in the big blank or not, doesn't matter. You have to have a number of days in the small blank. If you don't, the buyer's position will be, and we've had transactions in which we had the seller and our listing agent allowed the seller into a contract with nothing in the blank. And the buyer had something to object to. Nothing was in the big blank, but they had a right to object for other reasons. And the buyer said, okay, the number of days in the small blank is a limitation. It tells me I only have this number of days. There's nothing in there, which means I have all the way to closing. Terrible situation. Don't ever, if you've got the seller, don't let them accept an offer with that blank. If you've got the buyer, don't make it blank. You always have to have a number of days in that blank. Great question. I'm really glad you asked that.
Okay, thank you.
So and that gets a bit to Mary Ann saying, don't ever, if you've got the big blank, don't let the small blank stay blank. Always have something there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey,
Okay.
Bob,
Yes, ma'am.
this is Cheryl McCarter.
Hello, Miss Cheryl. How are you?
Good. Hey, going back to 6 on the title, and the exceptions will be amended to read shortages. Are you saying that for the buyer who gets a new survey, we should always still do the amended to read shortages? Or is that mainly with an existing survey?
Yeah. Good question. And this is where my bias for compliance comes into play. And it's what I've always done on any property I've ever bought when we were allowed to do this. New or existing survey, I always amend it. Because even though on a new survey, you say, well, I don't need this on a new survey because if there's a mistake on the survey, I can go to the surveyor. And you're right, if the surveyor is still in business.
Oh, that's a good point.
Because many of these survey shops, little person shops, they retire, they die, they move. And if you didn't do this, you have no recourse. You have nowhere to go.
Okay, great.
And you got to remember, it's a very small charge. 5% of the premium, the title policy, very inexpensive. Should always do it new or existing. So good question. I'm glad you brought that up.
Okay,
Thank
awesome.
you.
Thank you.
Okay. The next paragraph I have in my handout, if anything on these, is paragraph 7. And specifically, everything in paragraph 7 deals with property condition. All the paragraphs deal with property condition as you work through it in some way, shape, or form, even 7H, which deals with the home warranties. So I want us to go through and spend a little bit more time on some of these than others. In paragraph 7A, there are no boxes or blanks or choices there, but the purpose of 7A is the two parties need to understand they've agreed to certain things. Buyer and seller into a contract. Buyer said, I'll pay $300,000 of your property. Seller says, okay, I'll take $300,000. Buyer says, not so fast. I've got some due diligence I want to do. I want to make sure this property is worth $300,000, so I'm going to have an appraiser done. I want to make sure the condition is such that, so I'm doing inspections. I need to access the property and take a look at things and count the ceiling fans and have a painter come out. So I need access to the property. And the seller needs to understand, 7A, sellers agreed. Buyer, you have access to the property, and there's nothing in 7A that says, here are the only things you have access for. It doesn't say, here are the reasons. Have access. The only limitation at all is reasonable times. That only applies, frankly, to an occupied property. So access, inspections, and utilities. Buyer and seller have agreed to this. Where we get into trouble is people sometimes pull these inspection rights to paragraph 23, the option period. And they tend to want to say, well, you get to inspect the property during the option period, but what's the point of afterwards because you don't get to terminate anymore? Well, we know that's not true. There are too many other rights of termination. So sometimes those people pull those together. We've had situations where we had to talk to the agent very respectfully and say, let's read this paragraph one more time. Nothing in paragraph 7A says anything about the option period. Nothing in paragraph 23, the termination option, references anything to paragraph 7A. Two entirely separate issues. And as a good listing agent, you need to make your seller understand you've agreed to do this. And if you've got a problem with this, now's the time to do it. Now, the other factor with this that's important in today's environment with coronavirus, if you've got a seller who is occupying the property, you need to make sure we've really coordinated with that seller on all access. In fact, we've got now in our intranet that certification for property access form that everyone who's going to access property, including appraisers, inspectors, contractors, all those people have to have affirmed those statements and have to sign off on that to be able to do it. Because we want our seller to say, yeah, here are the conditions which will allow, because of the coronavirus, reasonable time takes on a new color, takes on a little different situation. And we've got to help the buyer and seller coordinate that because the buyer has certain things they need to do moving forward in their due diligence, proving up this is property they want to close on. But we've also got to protect the seller and make sure we work through that. So the coronavirus has kind of created some extra, pieces of the puzzle as we work through access to the property and inspections and contractors and people coming out. Because as much as possible, we want to limit people going out to a property, even a vacant property, but we want to limit that as much as we can. So I know you guys are being very careful as you're going through it. You're doing your virtual staging, virtual tours, working through it. But as a listing agent on an occupied property, you need to have the serious conversation with your seller. Okay, we've got a contract now. Here are the things the buyer's going to need to do. Let's talk about how we want that access handled. For example, unless there's a disability situation, when anyone other than the seller's family needs access to property, we don't want them there. We want to try to minimize that person-to-person contact. So when the inspector wants to come out and the appraiser wants to come out and all those people, we want that seller to not be there. And we need to have that conversation to see if our seller is going to work with us on those lines. So 7A has a little different feeling to it than it did 6 months ago. Any questions on that? Does everybody kind of understand where we need to be going with that?
It's Christine again. I do have a question on that. When we were selling our home last December, my husband is disabled and we were also taking care of our grandson back then. We told them, yes, you can come, but he naps between 1 and 3 and my husband would still be there. So they would come literally right in between his nap time. Oh, I'm sorry. And the first time we let him in, they woke him up, and it was not pretty. And so then at what point can we say, no, sorry, you're not listening?
It's a good question. And we have a number of scenarios that was before the coronavirus, but even now with elderly couples, that conversation needs to take place before the buyer and seller enter into a contract.
Okay,
You need to have that conversation with the buyer's agent and say, okay, we need to understand, we've agreed to certain things in paragraph 7A, but we need for you to understand we've got certain limitations here because we've got someone who's disabled, who's going to be in the house. We've got a child here. We've got this, whatever. And so we need for us to agree right now what's going to be reasonable has to be very specific. And you can even create an addendum to the contract, do whatever. You need to let the buyer's agent know, says, we're going to put specific showing instructions with Showtime or CSS or whoever. We'll let you know that you won't be allowed to come and access the property during these timeframes. But you need to have agreed to that before the buyer and seller enter a contract so they understand here are the limitations. Because that does happen. And it really comes down to the people, everybody coming together and agreeing, saying, yeah, here's what we're going to do.
thank you, Bob.
Everybody good with that?
Yeah,
Okay. In paragraph 7B is in Bob. There are three choices here. It deals with the seller's disclosure notice. In 7B1, the parties are acknowledging the buyer has it, which means the buyer has no rights of termination in relationship to the receipt of the seller's disclosure notice. And if you've got the seller, 7B1 is really the choice you want to have made. And if you've got a buyer and you're going to make an attractive offer to the seller, do everything you can to go ahead and get that notice, especially if it's in MLS, go and pull it down and make an offer with 7B1 checked off. Frankly, that makes your offer more attractive than a competing offer with 7B2 checked off. Because 7B2 is one of three powerful rights of termination. The other two are termination option, and the third one is mandatory HOA in A1. Powerful rights of termination. Because if 7B2 is checked off, the buyer has just picked up an automatic minimum 7-day right to terminate the contract for any reason, including they got up that morning and decided they didn't want to buy the house. Any reason. And the number of days in this paragraph, 7B2, don't mean anything. It's just kind of a suggestion that they're kind of saying, buyers kind of saying, so, well, we don't have it yet, but we'd kind of like it. So when you can, would you please send it over to us? It's not a default situation. It doesn't create anything other than a right to termination. And that's all it deals with. So 7B2 is a powerful termination for the buyer. And as you work through it. Now, for the listing agent, you get an offer and 7B2 is checked off. And it also, the buyer's paying $250 for a 10-day option period. No problem. Accept the offer, immediately get the seller's disclosure notice over to the buyer's agent, and everything is good. And you haven't given anything up because the seller's disclosure notice, right of termination, and the option period are independent, run parallel to each other, don't stack on each other. So the seller just picked up a free $250 because this right of termination, it was there, doesn't mean anything. He paid for 10 days, had 7 days here, but guess what? You already had that free. So your listing agent, look at what else is going on in the transaction as whether or not you need to deal with that. In 7B3, the only sellers who can check this is if they're one of the 11 sellers who are in the property code, section 5.008 property code. It lists 11 sellers who are exempt from completing the seller's disclosure notice. You should have that form. You should be comfortable with it. So when your seller receives an offer and 7B3 is checked, when your buyer is going to make an offer and the seller checks off 7B3, say, I don't have to do this because I'm an investor, or I bought a sight unseen, or I'm clueless about the property, or, I inherited the property or whatever. Well, he may or may not be on the list of 11. Being clueless about the property doesn't get you on the list of 11. So you need to be sure that if they check off 3, they really are, in fact, eligible for 3. They didn't just check it off for the heck of it. Question on 7B3? Did you work through that?
Bob?
Yeah.
I have a question on 7B2.
Okay.
If the buyer has not received the notice, what's a good reasonable time to put in that next blank within how many days?
Okay, so here's my question back to you. Why do we care? I want you to think about that. If you got the buyer and you're gonna check off 7B2, here's what you got to ask your buyer. How important is it for you to receive the sales disclosure notice? Understanding that whatever you do in 7B2 doesn't require the seller to do it. If the seller doesn't get the seller's disclosure notice to the buyer in this time frame, seller's not in default. Buyer just has a right to terminate the contract for any reason. So what you really are dealing with here, and it's a good question from this perspective. If the buyer says, you know, I don't really care whether I get it or not, I'm going to do inspections anyway, not that big a deal. And frankly, I know that this is somebody who inherited the property and they don't know very much, so I don't really care. If you put a longer time frame in there, not all listing agents understand. They haven't all been to our classes. They don't understand what this really means. And we've had buyer's agents putting, okay, let's put 15 days in there. And listing agent will thank you. Oh, you know, we really had trouble getting our seller to sit still and fill this out. So thank you for giving us 15 days. Thank you for giving us a lot of time. And you say, not a problem. Thank you for the 22-day free option period.
Yeah.
That's what's happened. So sometimes putting a longer time frame, if your buyer is not real concerned with getting the information, your buyer can sit here and say, yeah, let's make a longer time frame because it keeps your buyer in control of the contract. Now, if you put a time frame in here, what you need to understand about the buyer's rights, regardless of how many days you put in here, and let's say you put 10 days in there, buyer says, you know, I'd really like to have the seller disclosure notice. Let's put 5 days in there because I really would like to have it. Knowing that we can't make the seller do it, but if the buyer gets impatient, says, you know what, I don't understand why we don't have this yet. What can I do? Buyer can terminate the contract and get their earnest money back for any reason. From literally day one of the contract until they receive the seller's disclosure notice, and then 7 days after receiving it or closing, whichever comes first, buyer can terminate the contract for any reason. Buyer doesn't have to wait for the number of days to finish here. They don't have to wait even 1 day. Say, oh, it's been 1 day. Now to think about it, if I don't get it today, if I don't get it by 5 o'clock today, I'm out of here. They can terminate the contract. So it puts the buyer in total control of the contract.
Okay.
Does that make semi-sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Okay.
It's Kim Sunland. How are you
Hi,
today?
Kim. How are you? How's royalty
Good.
doing today?
Good, thank you. Okay, I do have a quick question on that, on the seller's disclosure notice. As a rule with the people that I was raised real estate with, we put the disclosure notice in MLS under other documents. Is that, I mean, I just feel like that's one of the best practices. Is that?
Yep. It's a great practice. From a listing agent standpoint, that's perfect that you do that. Now, here's what you need to understand. Having done that, which is what you should do, does not constitute delivery. The buyer's agent should,
Correct.
but they're not required to download it. So the buyer
Correct.
can still check off 7B2, but you're exactly right. That's what you want to do. You want to provide it. You want to put it in MLS. Same thing if you've got a lead-based paint house, you want to put that lead-based paint addendum. That's perfect. That's
Right.
exactly what you want to do. I agree with
Okay.
that. Yep. Good practice. Of course, being raised by royalty, you would know that's how that should be. So.
Yeah, I got lots of good stuff.
So the next thing, so we're good with 7B. 7C is just a statement in there. We all should be comfortable with the lead-based paint thing. In 7D, this is your as-is paragraph. It makes this an as-is contract. It's been virtually confirmed by every court in the state of Texas, with occasionally the exception of one little court down in Houston, but I think they've come around. And what this means is buyer and seller have been into a contract. They've executed a contract, and the buyer accepts the property in its present condition. They have a right to do inspection and so forth. But what the buyer and seller both need to understand, the seller is not required to do anything that was not in the original contract. So the buyer can do inspections. The buyer can make a request for repairs all day long, all the way to closing, but the seller is not obligated to any. The seller can say, nope, 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 not going to do it, not going to do it, nope, thanks for the offer, but nope, not going to do it. He doesn't have to because it's an as-is contract. Now, and 99% of the time, 7D1 is what's going to be checked off. If the buyer, however, does have something right now, let's say because of something in the seller's disclosure notice that they've already received as they're getting ready to write the offer, maybe something in MLS, the seller's already said that they're going to replace the roof. So the buyer may go ahead and put that in 7D2, check the box, put in good detailed information about the seller replacing the roof in 7D2, so that later when the buyer does inspections and they try to negotiate other repairs and the seller says no, the buyer still has the seller agreed to replace the roof in the original contract, so you can still hold the seller to that. So you may have some things that the buyer says, well, I know about these things right now, and I want the seller to agree to it. And if it's specific repairs and treatments, that can go in 7D2. Can't be any reference to inspections, lender required repairs, nothing like that. It has to be very specific. But most of the time it's going to be 7D1. Now, we do occasionally see a seller say, I want to put something in the contract telling the buyer that this is an as-is contract and I'm not doing any repairs at all. It's a little belts and suspenders. However, there is a reason sometimes for it, and it would go in paragraph 11, special provisions. We would treat it as a business detail. The seller would give us the language, and it'd probably be as simple as, you know, seller notifies buyer that they will not do any repairs on the property. Buyer is buying it as is. Now, sometimes the reason for doing that is when the buyer does their inspections and he starts negotiating repairs, there's an expectation, even though this is technically an as-is contract, the norm out there is buyer does inspections, buyer asks for repairs, buyer and seller negotiate repairs, and seller's going to agree to do something. And if the seller just blatantly says, no, 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 the buyer feels like they maybe have been taken advantage of, and they say, well, you know, I wish you'd told me that up front before I spent money on inspections, an option period, and all that stuff. It's been nice to know that you really aren't going to do anything. So sometimes there is not a terrible reason, a semi-valid reason for the seller to say, yeah, I want to make sure the buyer understands they're buying this thing, and what they see is what they get, and that's it. We're not going to do any repairs at all. Does that make semi-sense? So that's how the seller may want to go a little bit beyond what's just in 7D2, 7D. Everybody good? Before we go to 7E?
I'm good.
We're good. Okay. Here's our challenge with 7E. And we just had 3 weeks ago, and it was actually with one of our Rockwell agents. And it dealt with an issue relating to property approval in the third-party financing addendum, in which the buyer felt like the seller was obligated to do some repairs that the appraiser had come up with. And they said, you know, based on property approval in the third-party financing addendum, paragraph 2B, seller's required to do this. Well, we had to nicely, kindly say to the agent, well, you know what, that's an interesting thing you bring up. I think it's addressed actually in the contract somewhere. Gee, let's look. Oh, look at there, right there, paragraph 7E. Lender required repairs and treatment. Let's see what it says. Oh, unless otherwise agreed in writing, neither party is obligated to pay for lender required repairs. Oh, so seller is not obligated to pay for them. Buyer's not obligated to pay for them. No one is obligated to pay for it. Now, if they don't come to some agreement, contract terminates, buyer gets their money back. But there is no obligation. Lender required repairs cannot create an obligation. This happens a lot when we find ourselves in situations where the lender comes up with foundation issues, roof issues, you know, HVAC, things like that, and the buyer says, well, you know, seller, you got to do it. Lender requires it. If you don't do it, you know, this contract's dead. Lender's not going to do the loan. Well, buyer, that's kind of a problem for you. Maybe you need to get a different lender. And the seller may say, okay, your lender says, got to have a new roof or got to have foundation work. Well, guess what? You know, and we disclosed in our seller disclosure notice that this is a 15-year-old roof. And we negotiated a price with you, the buyer, for a house with a 15-year-old roof. If you want a new roof, it's going to be at a new roof price. So if we want to renegotiate the price based on some repair that your lender or you want to have done, we're happy to do that. But you need to understand, we're not required, you're not required, that's the end of the deal. So you need to be comfortable with that. You also kind of need to be comfortable. There's a little bit of a timeline there. I mean, a dollar amount. But if we have lender required repairs and you have a situation where the repairs are a lot, I mean, $45,000 in repairs, foundation, roof, new HVAC, and you look at it and say, wow, my gosh. A buyer may say, man, $45,000 in repairs. Seller, not a problem. I'll take care of it. I'll do it. I'll handle it. Buyer may say, wow, that's a lot of repairs. I don't think I want that house. Even if you're agreeing to do it, that's a lot of stuff has to be done in the house. I didn't realize it was in that bad shape. Well, you've got a number in paragraph 7E that if the lender required repairs exceed 5% of the sales price, the buyer can get out of the contract even if the seller agreed to pay for the repairs. Because the buyer may say, you sitting there with a $400,000 house and $40,000 worth of repairs, that's way beyond the 5% figure. Buyer said, whoa, man, I don't want that. He gets out of the contract, gets nurse money back. So you need to be somewhat comfortable when you have situations like that where that kind of thing might happen. Questions on 7E, how we need to understand that before we get to 7F? Okay, so 7F, I cannot overstate the importance of agents on both sides of the transaction understanding what has been agreed to in 7F. Because when we talk about repairs, and most of the time it's as a result, hopefully, of a very well-written repair amendment, nice and clear and specific. And hopefully as we go through that, we need to make sure we've determined who's going to do the repairs, what's the timing of the repairs, are there any requirements for our limitations for who can do the repairs? We need to know about completion repairs and treatments. And paragraph 7F sets forth that. The basic concept of it, and I'd really encourage you to really read through it, but the basic concept of it is we don't want the seller to be doing the repairs on the cheap. We want people who are doing the repairs to either be licensed if a license required, or if there's no license required, that's their business, is what they do all the time. We don't want just, somebody showing up just doing it. Certainly don't want the seller to do it unless the buyer and seller otherwise come to some agreement. So this sets up who should do it, who should not do it on that. And we need to make sure as we work through this, it also addresses warranties received by seller respect to it and buyer's expense. And we also need to make sure we've got a 15-day time frame there that we can extend a closing if we need to extend a closing because the seller can't or won't do repairs. The little flip side of that situation, if the seller is not doing the repairs in the time frame that before the closing and they're just not going to do it, that's now a default situation. You got to go to paragraph 15. What this is really designed to is sometimes you've had a storm and there are issues, or we have situations right now where sometimes some supplies are just not available as you're working through it. And so if there's something there that's going on, then we've got the ability to have a 15-day, a 5-day, if necessary, time frame to complete the repairs and treatments. And remember, the parties to the contract always have a right to mutually agree on extending the contract. They can do that anytime prior to closing as you go through that. So we good with what we're dealing with in 7F. I really cannot overemphasize both sides of the transaction, buyer or seller. You really need to understand what's going on there. Everybody good with that? Now, and I'm always open to other additional questions. To the next paragraph, I've got my handout. Is
Hey, Bob, I
paragraph
have a
9.
quick question on that.
Yeah. Okay.
This is Danielle Stevens.
Uh-huh.
Back on 7F, where it says at buyers, hold on, let me find it.
Buyer's election.
Yeah, transferable warranties received by the seller transferred to buyer at buyer's expense. Does that mean the seller has the right to charge them for giving them those transferable warranties?
No, it's not a seller. It's as if it's whoever has done the work. Now, keep in mind, I'm glad you brought that up, because keep in mind, we're not talking about previous warranties. We're not talking about they've got a foundation warranty from when they bought the property, had foundation work 5 years ago. We're talking specifically about repairs and treatments that are done under this contract. So we negotiated repairs, we negotiated retreatments. We had a contractor come out and do some work, and that contractor has a warranty. You know, electrician came out and he's got a 30-day warranty or a 90-day or whatever. We're talking about the contractor's warranty. We're not talking about the seller being able to charge the buyer, and we're only talking about any warranties relating to repairs or treatments done under this contract, not from previous.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Glad you brought that up. Now, paragraph 9, a closing paragraph. The purpose of paragraph 9 is to kind of set a target. And in Texas, this is probably true than many other states. In Texas, the closing date, one, it's an owner before date, but two, it's a reasonable time date. If the transaction doesn't close on April the 15th, that's the date in paragraph 9A. If it doesn't close on that day, the contract does not automatically terminate. One of my good agents kept using the phrase, well, the contract expired. No, it didn't. There is no expiration of the contract on this date. These are reasonable time contracts. Our problem is we don't know how long that is. Reasonable time is subject to the parties, and if they've got a dispute, subject to the court coming up and say, well, based on the transaction, we think reasonable time is 5 days or 10 days or 2 weeks or whatever. But it's a fairly short, reasonable time frame, but we don't know how long it is. But the key element is when things don't close tomorrow on the 15th, it doesn't mean everybody's in default. Now, it doesn't take away the rights. If the seller may say, well, seller says, I showed up at closing, I'm ready to close. Buyer, you didn't close, you're in default. Seller can take that position, but seller can't say, this is the time as the veteran's date, and you're in default, because if the buyer says, well, you know, I couldn't close on Wednesday because of the coronavirus and my lender and all that kind of stuff, but I'm closing Friday. Well, Friday is almost certainly a reasonable time, seller's going to have to close. If the buyer shows up with all the stuff, everything done and ready to close Friday, that's almost certainly going to be viewed as reasonable time. Doesn't keep the seller from on Thursday having sent a default notice out to the buyer, but the buyer is still going to have a reasonable time to perform whatever that means. And it's a very iffy, and we're in a position where we can't really say, yeah, I don't know what that is. But we need to understand, this contract does not expire, does not go away, does not automatically terminate. My phrase that I've used in class, contracts don't die, they have to be killed. And that's just how that works. Any questions? And remember my little thing, when you're writing an offer, make sure you've got a calendar in front of you when you put a date in there. Don't have it closing on a weekend or a holiday, please. So make sure you get that done. Now, in paragraph 9B, if we're ready for 9B, I want you to be really comfortable and familiar with the 5 subparagraphs in paragraph 9B. And what's in, because this is telling the buyer and the seller, here are obligations, here are things that are going on at closing. because everything we're talking about in paragraph 9 is what's going on at closing. You know, this is certain obligations. Everybody has agreed that they're going to do things. And I mentioned this earlier, look at paragraph 1. 9B1, seller's going to execute general warranty deed. 9B2, buyer's going to bring good funds except with escrow agent. 9B3, buyer and seller both agree. Whatever has to happen, whatever we have to sign off on, we agree to do it. And we agree to do it in the contract. You know, 9B4, hey, they're not going to be a liens or assessment, they're not be assumed in it. And 9B5 references a lease. And so if there's going to be a lease or anything in here, it talks about that. It also talks about leases in paragraph 10B, in paragraph 10B2. So you need to be comfortable with what the parties have agreed to do, because sometimes you'll have a buyer say, well, where does it say I have to do that? Well, it's right there in paragraph 9B. In paragraph 9B3, you go, oh, when you get that specific, they kind of say, oh, well, maybe I did agree to do that. Okay, fine. Everybody good with paragraph 9 and what's going on there? Paragraph 10. I don't want to go overboard, but if somebody were to take, and all 24 paragraphs of the contract are important, but if I were going to have to say, well, Bob, which one do you think might be the most important? I think it's paragraph 10. And here's why I think paragraph 10 is so important. We have two big things happening at closing. Potential things happening at closing. One, potentially a transfer of title. Two, potentially a transfer of possession. Paragraph 10 determines which of those two will happen, depending on which box is checked off. If you have closing and funding, then both possession and title will happen at closing and funding. If you have the next choice, where it's going to a temporary residential lease, then while title may have transferred, possession hasn't. And that's incredibly important, because until the seller delivers possession of the property to the buyer, even though the seller no longer owns the property, the seller is responsible for the property. If the buyer is allowed to move into the property under a buyer's temporary lease prior to closing, even though the buyer doesn't yet own the property, the buyer has accepted responsibility for the property under the terms of the lease. So possession has almost everything to do with who's responsible for this property. That's why we have in bold print in paragraph 10, and the bold print is there because of me. When I was on Brookline Committee, I said, this is so critical. We need to really emphasize this. And of course, then all the attorneys on Brookline Committee joked and said, oh, bold Bob. Bob wants all these things bold. Well, okay, fine. In fact, one of the attorneys said, Bob, the whole contract is important. Why don't we just bold the whole contract? Okay, fine. But here's the key. There are a few absolutes that we have in this business. We have some absolute rules. Somebody said, well, Bob, that's just your rule. No, it's really an absolute rule. One of your absolute rules is if the possession is different than the closing, whether it's buyer or seller, doesn't matter, you have to tell your client in writing that they should talk to their insurance agent about their coverage, because you've got a seller who doesn't own the property anymore and is still responsible. And so, you know, the buyer would want to know, well, gee, I've got a homeowner's policy, but haven't moved in the property. What if the seller stays in for a week and they burn the house down? Whose insurance is going to apply? And if the seller moves into the property and a windstorm comes and blows the roof off, seller's going to want to know, well, is my insurance apply or is it buyer's? They've got to talk to their insurance agent. You've got to give that advice in writing. That's an absolute. You can never, ever have a transaction if the title and the possession are done at different times. You have got to give them notice, written notice. Here's what they have to do. It's both in paragraph 10 of the contract, and it's also in the temporary residential lease, both of them. So I just cannot overstate how incredibly important that is. Any questions on that? And please, everybody nod their head and wave and says, yes, Bob, I can't tell you, we've heard that before, and we always do that. We're being good. We always do that.
Is the notification, in the contract?
Pardon
And is the notification that's in the contract in bold, as well as the notification that's in the temporary lease agreement, sufficient notification, or is there something further that we need to have
Okay,
documented to the?
good question. Neither of those are sufficient.
Okay.
Your client's not reading the contract. They your seller looked at paragraph 3C. How much do they pay me? Buyer look at 3C. Oh, how much am I paying? They don't read this. They don't read paragraph 10. They kind of look at, well, when I'm gonna get possession, that kind of stuff. You have to give written notice. It could be an email. There is no form.
Okay.
You have to give written notice. This is not sufficient. I cannot. Well, I can't. I can tell you. Last year, we had 6 situations in which we had something happen after closing, and neither party had talked to their insurance agent. And in 6 of those situations, 3 of them, our agent had not given notice. And we almost were in trouble, very close to it. You have to do this. You have to do it in writing because you've got to have the documentation. Don't rely on it being in the contract because that's not sufficient. It's just like putting something in paragraph, 6D, the big blank for objections. Here's what the buyer wants to do, and relying on the buyer to make sure they can do that. Not enough. You have to tell your buyer before you buy this house, before you close on it, you want to do this property, you want to put a pool in there, whatever you want to do with it, check it out before you close on it. Everybody good with that? Good question. So please, I want to make sure I cannot overstate that. Do it, do it, do it, do it. That's just one of your absolutes. And about a half a dozen of absolutes you got to do.
As far as closing, if the closing and funding are happening and the possession transfer are happening all on the same day, what time frame, and is it stated, does the seller, for example, have to get the move completed?
Okay, that's a really good question. What I would encourage you to do, because we're relying on closing and funding, which means we're relying on the title company giving everybody notice we funded, which means we're relying on what the title company says, here's what funding means. I would encourage you, whichever side you have, the parties ought to put something in paragraph 11, special provisions, that the seller shall provide possession of the property, deliver possession of the property to the buyer by 5 p.m. or 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. on the day of closing and funding. Because what had happened, and we just had this happen again about a month ago, had closing and funding, and title company was clear, we funded. In fact, they wired funds, and the seller said, well, I don't have them. I don't have the funds. Hadn't showed up in my account. So, until I get the money, I don't think funding has happened. Well, that's really not what the contract says, but we've had more than one seller take that position. And if you're having this happen late on a Friday afternoon, and now you've got a weekend, it's buyers were going to move in, now they can't, you've got a problem. So it's really important for the agents to get the parties to agree, here's what we're really talking about. And if you can put a timing in there, even here, or even if you're going to do a temporary residential lease, put a timing in the special provisions of the temporary lease. So I see Shirley raising a hand here. It says Shirley raised hand. Does that mean Shirley has a question? Is that what that means?
Yes.
Okay.
On where you're giving written notice, an email, is that sufficient?
Yeah. Courts love emails. Emails are time-stamped, time-dated. The key is, because it's so important, when you give important documentation like that and notices like that in email, make sure you keep it in your file. One of the things that, remember, one of my other absolutes, whenever you have an important conversation with your client, follow it up with an email so they acknowledge, so we're on the same page with what we just agreed to. So good question, Shirley, and emails are fine. Just make sure that your email is good, clear, detailed. And when you have a lengthy conversation with your client, you want to make sure you're all on the same page with what you think you've agreed to, go ahead and make sure you put that in there. So good. really
Okay.
good. Uh-huh.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. The other thing in paragraph 10 in 10B, make sure you're comfortable with the lease situation. Once you're in a contract, seller can't get into any leases. After that, without permission on the buyer's written consent. And if there are leases in there, then the buyer has to have copies of the lease, and we need to make sure that we handle security deposit, which is dealt with up in paragraph 9B5. At closing, that should be taken care of at closing. That's what I've got in my handout. We've had some good questions that kind of went a little bit beyond the handout on some things, which I'm happy to do. If you've got any other kind of things in there, I am so appreciative of all you fine folks showing up for a 101 class in a Zoom scenario. I would like a little bit of a sense, and maybe you can chat it or even say something. Do you feel like this is really a fairly effective way for us to be able to do this in this environment we're dealing with today? Everybody kind of thinks that this is kind of working out, and this is a way for you to, in the midst of everything else you're doing in your world, to get some good information and work through it and have some interaction and all. Everybody feel pretty good about it?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Good. Okay, good.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
On leases,
Yeah.
if the property is sold by a seller and there is already a tenant in the property and everybody's all happy that the tenant's staying, does the seller have to deliver the security deposit to the new buyer?
Yes, and that's in paragraph 9B5.
It is. Okay.
Yes, because the seller has to return the security deposit. This has to be done.
It sure is.
Yep.
There it is.
That's a great question, because this is a problem, because if they don't resolve that, the buyer now owns the property. The buyer's now the new landlord in the lease. And when the tenant says, oh, by the way, I want to make sure you do have my $5,000 security deposit, right?
Right.
No, I don't. And the seller's moved to Aruba now, so I'm kind of in trouble. Yeah. So you need to make sure that's handled there. Absolutely. Good question.
Thank you.
Any other follow-up questions? Because we pretty much have done our timeline here.
Bob,
Yes.
to follow up on Sally's question, does that happen in the closing documents to transfer the money from the seller to the buyer for a security deposit?
No, it's just the security deposit is paid by the seller to the buyer.
Okay, just write it.
It's a transfer. And I don't believe it shows up on the settlement statement. I really hadn't thought through that, and I'd be happy to ask one of my title company people about that, but I don't think that's the case, because it's not part of the terms of the contract.
Okay.
Anybody's got a different experience in that, this would be a great time to say, well, actually, Bob, I just had one of those last week, and here's what we did. I'm always open to learning new stuff there. Anything else, guys? You're doing great. I cannot overstate how much gratitude Shirley and Mike and Dick and Angie and all, that we've all got, and Christy and I, about what you're doing out there. Continue to work, doing a great job, following the guidelines. I make sure you've got our advisories that are on intranet, got our forms. Angie, we'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow afternoon in the 4:30 call. I'll get in the very first part of that, and Angie will make sure you understand where the forms that are now in command that you use in transactions that relate to COVID-19. And we've got 4 forms in there that we need to be familiar with and make use of. And so we so appreciate everything you're doing to keep us all safe and to work through it. And I'm trying to figure out if I'm going to have to go into therapy after, because this staying at home stuff kill me. I just, but I got to do it. I understand that, whatever. So, Julie, are you still here? Is my host gone or whatever? Is it work through it? Pardon me? You here?
I'm still here.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Guys, I am through. If anyone has any questions, do it now, or we're going to close up this meeting. Everybody good?
Thanks,
Thank you very much. Everybody good?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate, Julia, for you handling this for us. And I'm going to leave the meeting. We're done.
Thank
Bye.
you.
And see all you at 4:30.